The Arizona sun sagged low, bleeding red and gold across the sky. Heat shimmered off the hard-pan earth, and dust coiled around the hooves of two weary horses making their slow way home. Samuel Calder rode in silence, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. His daughter, Ruth, sat perched on a smaller mare beside him, her braids whipping in the dry wind. She hummed a tune to herself, something her mother once sang before the fever took her. Samuel didn't tell her to stop. The sound, faint and sweet, was the only softness left in the day. The desert stretched endless before them. Dry sage, jagged rocks, the skeletons of old cactus catching the dying light. Behind them, the town of Dry Creek was already swallowed by dusk. Samuel had gone there for supplies, nails, and a coil of rope, and maybe to hear if the cattle market was changing, though deep down he went just to feel a little less alone for an hour or two. Now he was heading home to the empty ranch, where silence and the creak of windmill blades were the only company left. Ruth tugged at his sleeve. "Papa," she said, pointing toward a gully off the trail. "Something moved down there." Samuel slowed his horse, eyes narrowing. The desert didn't forgive curiosity. He scanned the ravine. At first he saw nothing, just a tangle of mesquite and dry grass. Then he caught it, a faint, unnatural shift of burlap in the sand. The shape was too big for a rabbit, too still for a coyote. He swung down from his saddle, boots crunching the gravel. "Stay on your horse, Ruth," he said. "Could be a trap." She bit her lip, but didn't argue. Samuel unhooked his rifle and crept down the incline, each step deliberate. The heat had softened, but the air still clung thick and heavy, carrying the scent of dust and dry iron. As he neared, he could make out a rough burlap sack tied at both ends with frayed rope. Something inside twitched, a faint, pitiful sound. A human sound. He froze. For a heartbeat, the world went quiet except for the low rasp of the wind. "God help me," he muttered, lowering the rifle. He crouched and ripped the top of the sack open with his knife. A waft of stale air hit him, thick with sweat and blood. Inside was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her skin was the color of sun-warmed earth, her dark hair tangled with sand and thorns. Her wrists were raw where the ropes had bitten in. There were bruises along her arms and a gash across her temple. She was breathing, shallow and weak, her lips cracked and dry. When Samuel brushed away the dust from her cheek, she flinched and whispered something in a tongue he didn't know. Apache. He stepped back sharply. His pulse hammered in his throat. "Damn it," he said under his breath. "Papa?" Ruth called from above, her voice trembling. "Is it a person?" Samuel stared down at the girl. Memories came flooding, smoke rising from raids, shouts in the dark, the sight of his wife, pale and still, years ago after fever took her while he was away chasing Apache tracks that led nowhere. He'd built his walls high since then, out of grief and anger and endless work. The world beyond his ranch could burn for all he cared. He should walk away. It wasn't his fight. But Ruth was watching. His little girl, the last good thing in his life, was watching every move he made. He swallowed hard. "It's a woman," he said. "One of them." "Is she hurt?" Ruth's voice cracked. "Papa, please." "She's not our concern," he said sharply, tying the sack closed again, though looser now. "We'll tell the sheriff in town." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "She'll die out here, won't she?" The question hung between them. The wind picked up, swirling dust around Samuel's boots. He glanced down at the sack again, at the faint rise and fall of her chest. Leaving her would mean death, slow and cruel, the kind coyotes cleaned up after men's sins. Ruth dismounted before he could stop her. She stumbled down the slope, small hands clutching her skirt. "Papa, you can't," she cried. "You can't leave her like that." "Mama wouldn't." He caught her arm, voice rough. "Don't you speak of your mama now." But her eyes, the same clear hazel as her mother's, looked up at him, wide and wet. There was no anger there, only pleading. The sight of them cracked something deep in his chest that had been shut for too long. He cursed softly and sheathed his knife. "Fine," he muttered. "But if she causes trouble, it's on you," Ruth called her. Ruth nodded fiercely, tears glistening on her dusty cheeks. Together they untied the sack. The girl's limbs spilled out, limp and trembling. Samuel slid his arms beneath her. She weighed nothing. Skin, fever, hot. Bones, sharp beneath torn cloth. As he lifted her, her head fell against his shoulder, and she made a sound so faint it almost wasn't human. A whimper of pain, or maybe relief. He mounted his horse with her in his arms. Ruth followed close as the sun sank behind the jagged horizon, painting the land in deep, bruised colors. The ride home was silent, except for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the whisper of the dying wind. By the time they reached the ranch, night had swallowed the sky. Lightning flickered far off, silent for now, but promising rain that never seemed to come. The house loomed dark and still, the lantern on the porch swaying in the wind. Samuel carried the woman into the barn instead of the house, a habit of caution he couldn't shake. He laid her gently on a bed of hay, covering her with an old blanket. Ruth hovered near the door, clutching a canteen. "Should we call the doctor?" Samuel shook his head. "No doctor would ride out here for her kind. We'll clean her up, that's all." He poured water over a rag and wiped the dirt from the girl's face. Underneath the grime, her features were soft. High cheekbones, a scar along her jaw, lashes thick and black against her skin. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words he didn't understand. Ruth knelt beside him, watching. "What's she saying?" He listened, then shook his head. "Could be praying." They worked in silence. The wind rattled the barn boards, thunder grumbling in the distance. After a while, the woman stirred, eyes fluttering open. Dark eyes, deep and wild as storm clouds. She saw Samuel and tried to push herself up, panic flooding her face. "Easy," he said, hands raised. "You're safe." She didn't understand, but she felt the tone. Her breath slowed. She looked between him and Ruth, confusion and fear mingling in her gaze. Then, too weak to speak, she sank back onto the hay. Ruth placed a small hand on her arm. "You'll be okay," she whispered softly. "Papa says you can stay until you're better." Samuel shot his daughter a look, but didn't correct her. He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That's enough for tonight. She'll rest here." Ruth hesitated. "Can't she sleep in the house? It's cold." "She's not one of us," Samuel said flatly. The words came out harder than he meant. He saw Ruth flinch, and something inside him twisted, but he didn't take it back. "We'll see how she is in the morning." He turned and walked to the door. Ruth lingered, brushing the woman's hair away from her forehead. "Good night," she whispered. "You're safe now." Outside, the desert was alive with distant thunder. Samuel leaned against the fence, staring out into the darkness. The ranch stretched silent under the storm-lit sky, acres of hard earth he'd built with his hands and stubbornness. For years he'd told himself that was enough, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, something stirred in the emptiness. A question he didn't want to face. He lit a cigarette, the flame flickering against his weathered face. The smoke curled upward, thin and ghostly. Inside the barn, the Apache girl slept fitfully, murmuring in her language. Ruth curled beside her on the hay, refusing to leave. Samuel watched the light through the cracks in the wood, the gentle flicker of the lantern, the outline of two figures, one child, one stranger. He didn't know yet that the moment he opened that sack, his life had changed forever. He only knew that the desert, for the first time in years, didn't feel quite so empty. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, like a warning or a promise. Samuel took a long drag, exhaled into the wind, and whispered to no one, "Lord, what have I done?" Then he turned back toward the house, the door creaking shut behind him. In the barn, Ruth laid her head against the woman's arm, listening to the faint, steady heartbeat beneath her ear. The Apache girl's lips moved once more, this time in a broken whisper that sounded almost like a word Ruth knew. Safe. And for the first night in many years, the Calder Ranch slept with more than just ghosts beneath its roof. The storm never broke that night. It circled the desert like an angry spirit, rumbling low and heavy, teasing the land with flashes of white fire on the horizon. When dawn came, the air was thick with the smell of rain that never fell. Samuel Calder rose before the sun, same as always, his body moving through the motions of a man who'd lived too long by routine. He fed the horses, checked the fence lines, stoked the coals in the stove. But something in him felt unsettled. The memory of the girl in the barn gnawed at him like a burr under a saddle. When he pushed open the barn door, the morning light spilled across the hay. Ruth was asleep against the stall wall, her head resting on a folded coat. Beside her, the Apache girl lay still beneath the blanket, her face pale but peaceful. Samuel's gaze lingered on the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. Somehow that surprised him. He stepped closer, his boots soft against the hay. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound, dark and wary. She tensed, like an animal expecting a blow. Samuel lifted his hands slowly. "Easy," he said quietly. "Ain't here to harm you." She didn't understand, but the tone calmed her. Her breathing slowed. Her lips moved around words in her own language. Low, melodic sounds that made him feel like an intruder. Ruth stirred, blinking awake. "Papa?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Is she awake?" "She is," he said, straightening. "You need to eat. Then schoolwork. Go on." Ruth frowned. "She should eat too." Samuel sighed. "We'll see to that." He fetched a tin bowl, poured some water, and handed it to the girl. She sat up with difficulty, clutching the bowl in both hands as if it were something sacred. She drank greedily, then coughed, her whole body shaking. Samuel turned away, pretending to busy himself with the tools on the wall, but his jaw tightened. She wasn't a threat. Not now. She was half-starved, half dead. And yet she looked at him like a cornered wolf, proud even in weakness. He took one step toward her. She flinched. "I said easy," he muttered, setting down the water bucket. He gestured toward Ruth. "Here's my daughter." Ruth smiled shyly, holding up a piece of bread. "For you." The girl hesitated, eyes darting between them. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed Ruth's hand, quick, trembling, and she whispered something soft. It sounded like, "Thank you," though Samuel couldn't be sure. Ruth looked up. "Papa, what's her name?" He didn't answer. The girl spoke again, pressing her palm to her chest. "Tayen." Ruth tried the name on her tongue. "Tayen," she said brightly. "It's pretty." Samuel cleared his throat. "All right, she's got a name. Now eat your breakfast." The rest of the morning passed in uneasy quiet. Ruth stayed close to the barn, talking to Tayen in half words and gestures. The woman seemed to understand more than she spoke. She moved carefully, touching things as though every object held, meaning the wood grain of the stall, the straw beneath her fingers, the way sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls. Samuel watched her from a distance, unease prickling at him. He'd taken her in to ease his conscience, nothing more. He didn't owe her comfort. But still, something about the quiet gratitude in her eyes made him feel smaller than he liked. By afternoon, Ruth came running from the barn. "Papa, she wants to help!" Samuel looked up from the fence post he was repairing. "She's not well enough." "She says she can." Ruth grabbed his arm, eyes wide. She was fixing the harness by herself. He followed her back, muttering under his breath. Inside, Tayen was crouched beside the tack rack, her fingers deftly weaving leather strips together. Her movements were slow but precise, her face set in calm concentration. When she noticed him, she straightened quickly, fear flickering across her expression. He folded his arms. "You don't need to do that." She glanced at him, then gestured, her hand to her chest, then to the leather, and spoke one word in broken English. "Help." Samuel stared for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "Suit yourself." He turned away, but as he did, he noticed the way Ruth watched the woman, eyes full of wonder. The girl was learning without even realizing it. Learning kindness, patience, the kind of grace the West tried to beat out of people. Samuel felt a pang of something he didn't want to name. The days slipped by. Tayen grew stronger. Her wounds closed, leaving faint scars. She began to speak more. Short words, Simple phrases, enough to make herself understood. She spent her mornings in the barn and her evenings by the fire, mending clothes or humming in her language while Ruth sat nearby, trying to hum along. Sometimes Samuel found himself listening from the porch, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't. He told himself it was fine as long as it stayed quiet. But the quiet couldn't last. One afternoon, while fetching water from the well, Samuel noticed dust rising along the distant road. Riders coming fast. He felt his stomach tighten. When they drew closer, he recognized one of them. Harlan Dade, a rancher from the next valley, and two of his men. They reined up at the fence, eyes hard. "Afternoon, Calder." Dade called. "Heard a tale in town. I figured I'd check myself." Samuel kept his voice even. "That's so?" "Word is you took in an Apache," Dade said, spitting into the dirt. "That true?" Samuel met his gaze without blinking. "Ain't your concern what happens on my land." Dade's lip curled. "Hell, it's every man's concern if savages are crawling out from holes again. Folks got memories, Calder, bad ones." Samuel said nothing. His hand drifted toward the rifle leaning against the fence post, not as a threat but as a reminder. Dade noticed. "You always were stubborn. Don't make this something worse than it has to be." "She's one woman," Samuel said flatly. "Half dead when we found her. She ain't hurtin' nobody." "Not yet." Dade replied, turning his horse. "You think they don't come back for their own? You think you're safe keeping her here?" He spat again, voice low. "You're a fool." Samuel watched them ride off, the dust swallowing their figures. When he turned, Tyann was standing near the barn door, eyes wide. She'd understood enough to know the danger. Ruth stood beside her, clutching Tyann's hand. That night, the house felt smaller than usual. The air was heavy, thick with worry. Ruth asked, "Papa, they won't come, will they?" He forced a calm he didn't feel. "No one's comin'." But even as he said it, he checked the rifle twice before setting it beside the door. Later, when the moon rose over the plains, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stepped outside, the night cool against his skin. From the barn came a soft glow of lantern light. He walked quietly, boots scuffing the dirt. Inside, Tyann sat on a stool, mending a torn blanket. Ruth had fallen asleep beside her. Tyann looked up when Samuel entered, her eyes catching the lamplight. She didn't speak, but she smiled, a small, uncertain thing that made him stop in his tracks. "You should rest," he said gruffly. She shook her head. "Work keeps quiet inside." He frowned. "Inside?" She pressed her hand to her chest. "Here." He didn't know what to say to that. He leaned against the stall, watching her needle move through the fabric. Her hands were sure, steady. The silence between them wasn't heavy. For once it felt like peace. After a moment she spoke again, her voice soft. "You no trust me." Samuel blinked. "What?" She met his gaze. "I see. You look, but not see." The word struck him deeper than he wanted. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came. Tyann set down her sewing and looked at the sleeping child beside her. "She good heart," she said gently. "Like her mother." Samuel stiffened. "You didn't know her mother." Tyann lowered her eyes. "Don't need to, I see in her." He turned away, throat tight. "You get some sleep." He left before she could say more. Days turned to weeks. Life on the ranch began to find its rhythm again. Different now, slower somehow, but warmer. Tyann tended the animals, sang to Ruth while they worked, and cooked meals with herbs Samuel didn't recognize. The air in the house changed. Laughter returned in small bursts, uninvited but welcome. Even Samuel caught himself smiling once or twice when Ruth ran through the yard. Tyann chasing her, both barefoot in the dust. Still, he kept his distance. The world beyond their fences was watching, whispering. He could feel it in the stairs when he went into town, the tight nods that used to be greetings now turning cold. Harlan Dade's words hung in his mind like a storm cloud waiting to break. One evening, as the sun sank low, Ruth collapsed near the corral, her small body burning with fever. Samuel carried her inside, panic clawing through him. He'd seen that fever before, the same that took his wife. He sat by the bed, helpless, watching her sweat and shiver. Then Tayen was there, quiet as breath. She knelt beside Ruth, touching her forehead, murmuring words Samuel couldn't understand. He wanted to push her away, to keep control, to do something. But something in her voice stopped him. She moved with calm purpose, fetching herbs from her pouch, boiling water, mixing a bitter-smelling brew. "What is that?" he demanded. "Medicine," she said simply. "My mother teach." He hesitated. Then he stepped back. "If it hurts her, she live," Tayen said, steady and sure. "I promise." Hours passed. Samuel didn't leave her side. Tayen wiped Ruth's face with a cool cloth, whispered prayers, fed her the drink in tiny sips. The night dragged on, heavy with fear and hope tangled together. Just before dawn, the fever broke. Ruth's breathing slowed, her skin cooling against the sheets. Samuel sank into the chair beside the bed, exhausted. Tayen sat across from him, her face pale but calm. Their eyes met in the gray morning light. For the first time, Samuel didn't see an Apache. He saw a woman who had saved his child. "Thank you," he said quietly. Tayen smiled faintly. "She strong. Like father." He shook his head. "No, like her mother." For the first time in years, the name didn't ache when he said it. He looked at Tayen, truly looked, and saw the gentleness beneath her scars, the fire in her eyes that had refused to die even when left in the dirt. Something warm stirred in him, unfamiliar and frightening. Outside, the first rays of dawn spilled across the desert. The land glowed gold and alive. Ruth slept peacefully, her small hand clutching Tayen's fingers. Samuel rose, walking to the window. The horizon stretched wide and endless, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Behind him, Tayen's voice broke the silence, soft but sure. "Storm coming," she said. He looked out at the sky, clear, cloudless, calm, and felt it too. Not in the air, but in the heart. Something was coming, something he couldn't stop. The weeks after the fever passed felt quieter somehow, like the whole world was holding its breath. Ruth recovered slowly, her laughter returning in small bursts, the color back in her cheeks. Tayen stayed near her every step, never asking for thanks, never expecting anything. She moved around the ranch like she'd always belonged there, tending to the chores without being told, humming low melodies that floated through the dry air like prayers for peace. Samuel found himself watching her more than he wanted to admit. He tried to tell himself it was caution, that he needed to keep an eye on her, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and harder. He was drawn to her, to the quiet grace in her hands, the way she smiled when Ruth spoke, the way she looked out at the horizon each evening, as if speaking to ghosts only she could see. The town had started whispering. Samuel could feel it whenever he rode in for supplies. Eyes followed him. Old friends who no longer waved, merchants who counted his change without a word. Once, he heard someone mutter as he passed, "Calder's gone soft." Took in one of them. He didn't stop to argue. The truth wouldn't change their minds. Hatred was older than reason in these parts. But hatred, like drought, had a way of spreading. One morning, while Samuel was mending a corral gate, Ruth came running, breathless, her face pale. "Papa," she gasped, "men at the creek. 3 of them. They was watching." Samuel wiped his hands, frowning. "You sure?" She nodded, eyes wide. One had a red scarf, like Mr. Dade's man. He set down his tools and walked toward the barn. Tayen was inside, milking the cow, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She looked up when he entered, sensing the change in him before he spoke. "You seen anyone near the house?" he asked, her brow furrowed. "No. Ruth says Dade's men are watching." Tayen's expression darkened. "They come for me." Samuel didn't answer. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that men like Dade just barked to hear themselves echo. But deep down, he knew what fear looked like, and it was written all over her face. She'd lived it before, the look of someone who'd been hunted and survived only because luck had pity. That night, The ranch seemed to shrink under the weight of silence. Samuel lit only one lantern, keeping the house dim. Tyann sat near the fire, sewing quietly, Ruth leaning against her shoulder half asleep. Samuel watched them from his chair, the orange light flickering across their faces. He remembered a time when that same light danced on his wife's hair, when laughter filled this house instead of worry. Tyann looked up suddenly. "You think they come tonight?" He hesitated. "I don't know, but if they do, they won't find us unready." Her hand tightened on the needle. "You fight, always fight. It's the only way this land listens." She shook her head slowly. "Not always." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that silenced him. He looked at her, trying to read the secrets behind those dark eyes. She had seen more war than he ever would. That much he knew. And yet she spoke of peace like it was something real, not just a word whispered over graves. Ruth stirred, yawning. "Mama Tyann," she murmured, the name slipping out unthinking. Both adults froze. Samuel's chest tightened. Tyann looked down, her expression unreadable, then smiled faintly and brushed the girl's hair from her face. "Sleep, little one." When Ruth was settled, Samuel stood, restless. "She called you, Mama." Tyann nodded, eyes still on the child. "She need one." "She had one," he said quietly. Tyann's gaze met his then, steady and calm. "And you?" He swallowed. "I buried mine." She looked into the fire, the light catching the faint scar along her jaw. "Then maybe both of us know how to be ghosts." Her words hit him harder than any bullet could. He had no reply. Outside, a coyote howled, long and low, and the sound carried through the walls like a memory that refused to fade. The next day, Samuel rode into town for feed. The moment he tied his horse outside the general store, he felt it. The way conversations dipped, the way faces turned away too quickly. He ignored it, stepping inside. The storekeeper, Jenkins, nodded curtly. "Morning," Samuel said. "Morning," Jenkins muttered, eyes on his ledger. Samuel gathered what he needed and paid. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Harlan Dade leaning against a post outside, arms crossed, a smirk beneath his thick mustache. "Calder?" Dade drawled. "How's life with your new squaw?" Samuel stopped cold. The room went still. Dade pushed off the post, walking closer. "Heard she's real handy." "Must make the nights less lonely, huh?" Samuel's hand shot out before he could think. His fist connected with Dade's jaw, the crack echoing down the street. Dade stumbled, then straightened, blood on his lip, rage burning in his eyes. "You'll regret that," he hissed. "You think this town's gonna let you play house with a savage?" Samuel stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "You come near my land again, I'll put you in the ground myself." The air between them pulsed with violence. Then Samuel turned, mounted his horse, and rode out without looking back, but the whisper followed him all the way home. "You'll regret that." When he reached the ranch, Tyann was in the garden Ruth had helped her plant, coaxing green life out of hard soil. She saw his face and knew before he spoke. "Trouble," she said softly. He nodded. "They won't stop." Her hand stilled over the plants. "Then we leave." "This is my land," he said sharply. "I built it." She looked up, her eyes filled with something between sorrow and admiration. "Land don't care who builds it, only who buries on it." Her words made him angry because they were true, but pride was all a man like him had left. "We stay," he said. That night, Ruth's laughter filled the house again for a little while. Tyann told her stories from her people, stories of stars that fell in love with rivers, of spirits who guarded the wind. Samuel listened from the porch, the scent of smoke and earth in the air, the sound of Tyann's voice, soft and steady like a river smoothing stones. He could almost forget the danger waiting beyond the dark. But danger didn't forget him. 2 nights later, the dogs barked long after midnight. Samuel woke instantly, reaching for his rifle. He looked out the window. Shadows moving beyond the corral, torchlight flickering. 3 riders, maybe 4. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his boots, and loaded the gun. "Stay with Ruth," he told Tyann, his voice calm but clipped. She shook her head. I fight. You're not. I fight, she repeated, eyes blazing. He didn't waste time arguing. They stepped out together, the air cool and sharp, the kind that carried every sound. The riders dismounted near the barn, whispering, their torches painting the wood in trembling orange. Samuel raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. "Get off my land!" he shouted. The men froze, then one stepped forward. "Dade." His voice came cold across the distance. "You had your chance, Calder. We're just doing what you don't got the guts to do." Samuel cocked the rifle. "Last warning." Dade laughed. "You protecting her like she's your wife now?" That was the moment everything broke. Samuel fired. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the night. Horses screamed. The barn door swung open as Tyann pulled Ruth inside, shielding her with her body. A bullet ripped through the wood, splintering above them. Samuel ducked behind the trough, returning fire, counting shots, counting breaths. Then he heard it, a cry, high, sharp, and all too familiar. He turned just as Tyann staggered into the open, blood staining her shoulder. She was still standing, still holding Ruth behind her. Samuel's heart stopped. He ran, firing blind, shouting her name, though he barely knew he'd said it. The attackers broke and fled into the dark, their courage dying faster than their bullets. Samuel dropped to his knees beside Tyann. Her breath came ragged, eyes fluttering, but she was alive. Ruth was sobbing, clutching her hand. "Papa, she saved me," she cried. "She saved me." Samuel pressed his hand to the wound, voice shaking. "Stay with me, Tyann." Her lips trembled. "You safe?" "We're safe," he said. "Because of you." She smiled faintly. "Good." Ruth's tears fell onto her arm. "Mama, Tyann, don't go." Samuel froze. The word hung there, fragile and true. Tyann's eyes met his, soft and filled with something that looked like peace. "Mama," she whispered, repeating it as if it were the holiest word she'd ever heard. Then her eyes rolled back, and she went still. Samuel lifted her in his arms and carried her inside. The house smelled of smoke and gunpowder. He laid her on the table, trembling hands working to stop the bleeding. Hours passed. The candles burned low. Ruth prayed in whispers beside him, words broken by tears. Samuel didn't pray, not out loud, but every beat of his heart was a plea. When dawn finally broke, Tyann stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then clear. She looked up at him and tried to speak, but he hushed her, voice raw. "You're home," he said. Outside, the sky was painted in gold and crimson, the storm clouds finally breaking far away. The land looked washed clean, reborn. Ruth climbed onto the bench beside Tyann, her small fingers curling around the woman's hand. Samuel stood at the window, the rifle leaning forgotten against the wall. The horizon stretched wide and empty, but for the first time in years it didn't feel lonely. Behind him, he heard Ruth whisper to Tyann, voice soft and full of love. "I told you, Mama Tyann, Papa listens when you're here." Samuel turned, and his eyes met Tyann's across the room. No words were spoken. None were needed. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Inside, the Calders, all three of them, watched the lights spill across the desert, knowing the world beyond their fence would never understand. But here, in this fragile peace, they didn't need it to. The morning after the attack came soft and gray. The world seemed to hold its breath as if even the wind was afraid to disturb the fragile quiet. Smoke still hung in the air from the torches that had burned out in the dirt. Samuel stood on the porch, his hands rough and trembling, staring at the faint trails of hoofprints that led away into the horizon. The men were gone, but the danger wasn't. Out here, hate never rode far. Inside the house, Tyann slept. Her shoulder was bound tightly with cloth, her skin pale beneath the morning light. Ruth sat beside her, refusing to move, small fingers curled around Tyann's hand. Every few minutes she would whisper, as though speaking might keep her alive. Samuel couldn't listen for long. Each word twisted something deep in him. He'd seen death before. Too much of it. But the thought of losing her, This woman who'd come from nowhere and turned his life inside out was something else entirely. It felt like watching the sun sink for the last time. He stepped into the yard, boots sinking into the soft, torn soil. The windmill creaked overhead. A crow called out somewhere far away. He leaned against the fence, his breath steady but his mind not. He'd spent his life building this ranch out of stubbornness and grief. It was all he had left after the fever took his wife. But now, when he thought of what he had, it wasn't land that came to mind. It was Ruth's laughter, Tyann's quiet strength. The way the three of them had somehow made this hard land feel like home again. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Tyann stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but her eyes alive. He crossed the yard in 2 strides. "You shouldn't be up," he said. She smiled faintly. "I live. I walk." He shook his head. "You ought to rest." "Rest later," she murmured. "Now breathe." He almost smiled at that. There was something about her voice, calm, certain, that made even the hardest moments feel bearable. She moved slowly toward the corral, her bare feet brushing the dust. The horses lifted their heads when she passed. She whispered to them in her language, low and rhythmic. Samuel watched, the sight of it stirring something deep in him. When she turned back to him, her expression had changed. "You fight them again?" she asked softly. "If they come, I will." Her eyes darkened. "You can't fight the whole world, Samuel." He crossed his arms, jaw tight. "Then I'll fight the part of it that comes for my family." At that word, family, something flickered in her eyes. She looked away quickly, but he saw the hint of tears she tried to hide. "You call me that now?" He hesitated. "You saved my child. You're part of this, whether I asked for it or not." Her voice dropped. "I didn't save her for you." "I know," he said quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and smoke. Then Tyann took a step closer. "When I was a child," she said softly, "my people tell story of 2 rivers, one red with dust, one clear with rain. They hate each other, but the earth make them meet. Where they meet, flowers grow." He looked at her, not sure what to say. She smiled faintly. "We meet like that, maybe." He wanted to speak, but before he could, Ruth's voice called from the porch. "Papa, someone's coming." Samuel turned sharply. A lone rider was approaching down the ridge. Not Dade this time, but the sheriff. A man caught between law and loyalty, worn by years of watching blood spill into dust. He reined up outside the fence. "Calder," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard what happened last night." Samuel didn't answer. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Tyann. "She all right?" "She's alive." The man nodded, expression unreadable. Words spreading fast. "Dade's stirring folks up. Says you fired on him, unprovoked." "That's so?" Samuel said, his voice low. "Funny how liars always tell their story first." "I don't doubt your word," the sheriff said, "but I can't stop what's coming. You should think about getting her out of here before someone else tries again." Ruth stepped out beside Tyann, clutching her hand. "She's not going anywhere," the sheriff sighed. "I know what she means to you, kid, but the town won't see it that way." Samuel's face hardened. "They see what they want. Always have." The sheriff looked at him long and hard, then said quietly, "You're a good man, Calder. Don't let hate make you forget that." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust that faded into the horizon. Samuel stood still long after he was gone. Tyann touched his arm gently. "He speak truth. Truth don't change much out here," he said. "No," she agreed softly, "but it change hearts." That night they lit no lamps. The house was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Ruth slept between them on a bedroll near the fire, her breathing slow and peaceful. Samuel sat by the window, rifle resting against his knee, eyes scanning the dark. Tyann moved quietly around the room, the shawl slipping from her shoulders, her hair loose and dark against her skin. "You watch all night," she said. "No rest?" "I'll rest when I'm sure we're safe." She came closer, kneeling beside him. "No one's safe forever, not even the land." He turned to her. What's that mean? Means the storm don't ask who it breaks. Her voice was so quiet it almost disappeared into the wind outside. He looked at her for a long time. The curve of her cheek, the strength hidden beneath the scars, the life in her eyes that refused to die. He realized then that she wasn't just someone he'd saved. She was someone who'd saved him right back. When he spoke, his voice was rough. If I'd left you out there that day. You didn't, she said simply. He nodded slowly. No, I didn't. She reached up and touched his face. Gentle, trembling, he didn't move away. The world outside the window was endless, but in that small space between them, everything felt close, real, and alive. You have walls, she whispered. High ones, but even stone can learn warmth. He closed his eyes. You talk like the land itself. Maybe I am the land, she said softly, smiling, always trying to forgive what cuts it. He laughed under his breath, the sound low and tired but honest. For a long time they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the stars stretched endless above the desert, bright and cold. At dawn, Samuel stepped outside again. The horizon was painted with streaks of gold and rose. Tyen followed him, Ruth clinging sleepily to her side. The world smelled of new rain, faint but real. The first scent of hope in months. We go? Tyen asked quietly. Samuel looked over the land. The fences he'd built, the barns repaired, the graves at the hill's edge where his wife rested beneath a single stone. No, he said finally, we stay. But we live different now, not afraid. Tyen looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Then we build again. They spent the next days repairing what had been broken. The bullet holes in the barn, the broken window, the fear that had settled deep in their bones. Tyen worked beside him, slow but steady, her arms still bound but her spirit unshaken. Ruth carried nails and fetched water, singing under her breath the songs Tyen had taught her. The house began to feel alive again, as though it too had survived something worth remembering. At sunset, they sat together on the porch. The air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets. Samuel's arm rested behind Ruth, who leaned against Tyen's shoulder. He watched them and felt something stir inside him, not just love, but peace. The kind of peace he'd forgotten existed. You ever think about leaving? He asked quietly. Tyen looked toward the horizon. Sometimes. The wind calls. My people gone, but the land still remembers. Then why stay? She smiled faintly. Because here, someone remembers me. He turned to her, caught by the softness in her voice. I do, he said. She reached for his hand. Then that is enough. The last light of the sun painted their faces in gold. Ruth yawned and curled up between them. Samuel looked out over the desert, the endless stretch of red and amber earth that had taken so much and yet, somehow, given this back. He thought of Dade and the others, of the hate that still lingered out there like smoke that never fully cleared. It would come again someday, but when it did, he wouldn't face it alone. Tyen leaned her head against his shoulder, whispering words in Apache that he didn't understand but felt deep in his chest. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of rain falling on dry ground, of flowers pushing through dust. And somewhere in that dream he heard her voice, clear and certain. Even in dust, she said, love grows. When the wind swept across the plains that night, it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like home. The summer came in slow and golden, bleeding warmth across the desert like a promise that the land itself had decided to forgive. Weeks passed since the night of gunfire, since Tyen bled onto the same earth that once tried to bury her. The scars on her shoulder had begun to fade, but not the memory. It lived in Samuel's mind like the ghost of lightning after a storm, bright and impossible to forget. The ranch was alive again. Grass pushed up between the stones, the air rich with the scent of horses, dust, and something new, peace. Ruth spent her mornings helping Tyen tend to the garden, laughing with the wild kind of joy only children still trusted. She'd grown taller, her face darker from the sun, her hair tied with a strip of blue cloth Tyen had woven for her. When she smiled, Samuel could almost see her mother in her eyes, and he wondered if somewhere his late wife watched over them with a quiet nod of approval. Each morning, Samuel rose before the light. He'd find Tyen already outside, barefoot in the grass, whispering her prayers to the horizon. She'd face the east, palms open, eyes closed, her hair dancing in the soft wind. He never disturbed her. There was something sacred in the way she greeted the dawn, something that didn't belong to him but that he felt honored to witness. When she finally turned toward him, she always smiled. Small, knowing, enough to make him forget the weight of years. They had fallen into rhythm without realizing it. She cooked while he mended fences. She sang while Ruth fetched water. The silence between them wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. And yet, beneath that peace, something else grew, something neither of them dared to name. One evening, Samuel found Tyen sitting alone near the edge of the corral, watching the sun melt behind the mountains. He joined her quietly. The air smelled of sage and smoke. "You never told me much about your people," he said. She didn't look at him. "Not much left to tell." "You could tell Ruth," he said gently. "She'd like to hear." Tyen's hands rested in her lap. "She hears already. In the songs. The stories of the wind." He nodded. "You still miss them?" "Every day." She turned then, her gaze steady. "But I miss who I was with them more." He studied her face. The calm strength, the faint sadness that never truly left her eyes. "You're still her," he said. "The woman who fights, who saves." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. But the land changes us. You know that." He couldn't argue. The land had carved him down to bone and willpower, burned away every easy thing. But it had also given him this strange, quiet life that felt more real than anything before it. That night, the three of them sat around the table, sharing cornbread and stew. Ruth chattered about the foal that had been born that morning, how she'd named it Starfire because, Tyen said, it was born under a sky full of stars. Samuel laughed, the sound rusty but warm. For a moment, everything felt simple again. No hate, no past, no ghosts, just family. Later, after Ruth had gone to bed, Tyen lingered by the fire. Samuel sat across from her, watching the flames dance in her eyes. The silence between them grew heavy, but not uncomfortable. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked quietly. She looked into the flames. "I believe the wind carries us where we need to go." "And where's that?" She lifted her gaze to him. "Here." The words settled between them like a heartbeat. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "When I found you, I thought it was a mistake. I told myself I was only saving a life because Ruth begged me to. And now?" He looked at her, really looked. "Now I think maybe you were saving mine." She smiled. Soft, sad, beautiful. "Maybe we saved each other." He reached across the table, his rough hand brushing hers. For a moment she didn't move. Then her fingers turned, twining gently with his. The fire crackled. Outside, the night wind whispered through the grass. There were no grand words, no promises. Just a quiet understanding that something bigger than either of them had taken root in this place. Days turned into weeks again. The ranch began to feel whole, as if the earth itself was breathing easier. The town eventually quieted. Even men like Dade learned to look away. Rumors faded like old tracks in the sand. Samuel stopped caring what they said. The world could judge. He had already chosen his truth. One afternoon, while Ruth played near the creek, Samuel and Tyen rode out to the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the land stretched wide and endless. Red rock, golden plains, and skies so blue it hurt to look at. The wind tugged at Tyen's hair. "This is where I first thought of leaving," she said softly. He turned toward her. "And what stopped you?" She smiled. "You did." He looked out across the land. "I used to think I belonged to this place. Now I think it belongs to us." Tyen leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Then promise me we keep it that way." "I promise." They rode back slowly, the sun falling behind them. Ruth ran to meet them, her laughter carrying across the fields. Tayen dismounted first, catching the girl in her arms. Samuel watched them. The way Ruth buried her face against Tayen's neck, the way Tayen's smile reached her eyes. It was a sight he never wanted to lose. But peace, in the West, was fragile. It lasted only as long as men allowed it. The trouble came quietly, just as the sky turned silver with dusk. A rider from town, dust on his boots, breathless with urgency. He said Dade had been found dead, shot near the riverbank. Folks were saying Calder's hand was behind it. Samuel didn't need to hear more. The town's hate had found new fuel. That night, the house filled with silence again. Ruth didn't understand, but she could feel it. The tension thick as the desert heat. Tayen sat beside the window, staring out into the dark. "They'll come," she said. Samuel nodded. "Maybe, but not like before. I'm ready this time." She turned to him. "And if you die?" He met her eyes. "Then I die protecting what's mine." Her voice trembled. "We're not yours to die for, Samuel." He stepped closer. "You are everything I've got left to live for." She looked at him for a long moment, then took his face in her hands and kissed him. It was a soft, desperate thing, full of fear and love, and all the words neither of them could say. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "Then live," she whispered. "Promise me that, whatever happens." He nodded, though his chest ached. When the riders came, they didn't come with torches this time, only with the cold intent of men who thought themselves righteous. Samuel met them at the fence line, rifle in hand, his figure outlined by the lantern's glow. Tayen stood in the doorway behind him, Ruth clinging to her dress. The leader spoke, his voice hard. "We don't want blood, Calder, just justice." "There's been enough blood," Samuel said. "Then hand her over." Tayen stepped forward. "No." Samuel raised his rifle. "You'll have to take her from me." The standoff stretched into forever. The wind blew dust between them, the sound of the world holding its breath. Then one man moved. A mistake, a twitch, and gunfire split the air. The first bullet grazed Samuel's arm, but he didn't fall. He returned fire, his jaw set. Tayen dragged Ruth to the ground, shielding her with her body. The fight was quick, chaotic, full of noise and smoke. When it ended, only silence remained, broken by the sound of Ruth crying. Tayen crawled to Samuel, who was bleeding but alive. She pressed her hands to his wound, whispering prayers through her tears. "I told you," she said softly. "The storm don't ask who it breaks." He smiled weakly. "But sometimes it leaves flowers." Dawn found them together on the porch, the bodies buried, the land quiet again. The sun rose over the horizon, washing the desert in light. Tayen sat beside Samuel, her head on his shoulder. Ruth slept curled in her lap. He looked out over the fields, over the life they'd fought to build. "It's over," he said quietly. Tayen nodded. "No, it's beginning." The wind carried her words across the plains, over the graves and the broken fences, over the endless land that had seen so much pain and somehow still bloomed. Samuel wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. She leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even in dust," she said, "love grows." And as the light filled the sky, the Calder Ranch stood in quiet peace. Three hearts bound not by blood or name, but by the simple, enduring truth that love, when fought for, could heal even the wildest land. In the heart of a land carved by dust, blood, and unforgiving sun, Samuel, Tayen, and little Ruth proved that love could grow even where hope once died. Their story wasn't written in wealth or power, but in sacrifice, in the gentle defiance of two souls who chose compassion over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, and family over fear. The frontier taught them that peace isn't found in silence, but in the courage to love what the world tells you not to. And in that quiet ranch beneath the endless sky, their love became more than survival. It became legacy. If you were moved by this tale of love, redemption, and courage in the untamed West. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every story rides deep into the heart of the frontier, bringing you more unforgettable romances, raw emotions, and the kind of love that could only be born from dust and destiny. Saddle up, partner. There's more where this came from.